Over 300 skulls went into the construction of this board, and that seemed like a lot when I ordered this box from my friend's game store. Welcome everybody. If we have not met before, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield, and this WarCry game board right here has been the custom project I've been teasing for a couple months now. It is basically a nice fancy terrain setup with these metal dividers or table quarters, all built into a nice solid oak wooden base with a whole bunch of resin to give it a nice clear top finish for laying down your WarCry terrain. And yes, it took a heck of a lot of time, and I'm going to show you how to build this today. The game board terrain itself that's underneath the resin has two layers to it. One is just foam core board. I cut that out to be the size of a WarCry Battlefield. For the second layer, I thought I'd do a bit of a risky purchase per se and buy some Woodland Scenics modeling sheets. I was afraid to be some sort of over-glorified foam core board, but they turned out to not be that. In fact, they're actually some really nice foam for getting interesting shapes. For the stone pathways that are kind of embedded in a few places here in the battlefield, I actually created some 3D printed tiles. These are custom things that I made, and you can follow a tutorial I've got for doing custom WarCry bases for Blender. It's basically the same process, just made them a certain shape, and it went from there. And then to get some more detailed shapes on top of that, I did plenty of sculpt and mold work. With the basic construction of the board complete, let's do some painting, some flocking with grass, and then some snow, and we can call that part of the build done. Yes, the pits of skulls. I took some Mod Podge glue, stuck some skulls in, applied more flocking. Yeah, so this process here with the skulls, it's been the most tedious part of the build. 300 skulls-ish, about one at a time. Let's get back to work. Now we're working on some blood effects. This is mostly dry brushing with different shades of red paint. I got some Mephiston Red from Citadel, and of course Evisceration from Cultcraft. And then we'll apply some other effects to the snow to make it like there's blood splatter there with these paints, as well as a bloodletter glaze and a little bit of Seraphim Sepia to get a little bit of a darker blood tone. So for the final step, I've got some Woodland Scenic Cement. I'm going to spray some of this all over the board and call this part of the process done. Yay for double saturation because somebody forgot to hit record. Now we're moving on to making the base of the board, and this sucker's going to be heavy because whenever you make a custom object, it's never a bad idea to make it double as a self-defense weapon. Therefore, I've got two giant boards here of red oak, 3/4 inch thick. So yeah, this thing is going to be very, very heavy. I'm going to cut these guys up in the miter saw, glue them together. But before I do that, let me talk a bit about sizing. The board itself is 30 inches by 22 inches. However, I want to put some molding around it. So therefore, the wood base needs to factor in the size of that molding, which is 3/4 inch. Therefore, our final dimensions of the board are going to be 23.5 by 31.5. That being said, I'm going to cut the wood to be a little bit larger and trim it down after I've got everything glued in place. At this point here, I want to jump in and talk a little bit about some details of woodworking to save you some headaches you're going to see here in just a few moments. Now, I thought I had some scraps of the actual red oak I used for the base left, but apparently I do not. This piece of poplar will do well. What you're going to notice if you look on the end grain of the board, usually there's going to be a bit of a kind of arcing shape to the end grain. You're going to see it kind of go up one side, go down the other. It depends on how the board was cut from the tree, but there's going to be a bit of a curve to that end grain. When you glue up panels of boards, you want to make sure that the shape of this end grain is opposite for each adjacent board. So the first one here has a little bit of an upside down U shape, the one next to it has a U shape, the one after that has an upside down U shape, and so on. By doing it like that, you're going to reduce the chances of certain types of warping, as you'll see in just a little bit here. Well, the baseboard is glued up and it's drying. I'm going to take a little bit of time here and clean up the edges of the actual game board itself. I'm going to take my power sander and knock that back a little bit and get a nice, clean, finished edge. So something went a bit askew with the glue up process, and this board isn't exactly flat. So it's time to bring out the heavy guns to solve that problem. Fortunately, I don't really care a whole lot how this thing actually looks. It's all going to be covered up. It's pretty much just a piece to add substantial weight to the base of the board and make it feel kind of awesome. Well, that was an adventure. I cut miter corners basically just frequently enough that I half forget everything every time I do it, and there's always a few mistakes. Yeah, so anyway, they're done, and now we're going to start gluing things down on the board. I've got my outline here traced out in the black Sharpie, and I'm going to more or less follow that along for installing the various mitered edges here, making sure that each corner is actually 90 degrees, and then a little bit later on I'll bring the board back in and make sure everything's looking good. I'm using my Japanese pole saw to roughly cut down the base to a little bit outside of the molding itself. Now to really clean things up, I'm going to be pulling out my trim router here. I'm using a template routing bit, and the base of the molding itself is going to be the quote template. When it comes to a number of scenarios in WarCry, table quarters are often very important, whether it's controlling them, holding a certain one, something like that. So for this board, that's when you got a bunch of metal sitting around. So for this board, I'm going to be using a pair of brass rods here that I purchased from the store to represent the grid on the actual map itself. Now, a few notes quickly: when you buy these rods like this, make sure they're actually straight. Oftentimes they're not, because people bend them up when they're looking at them in the store. And if you really want to, you can use other metals. So I try to make some out of aluminum. But yeah, that's a little bit of a messy process, and frankly, this is the easier way to go. Something like that should be pretty good. So before I take the actual board and put it into the wood base here, I want to finish the wood base. I'm going to be using some spray polyurethane because it's simple and easy. So I'm not entirely sure what happened exactly. This is what you call cupping when it comes to woodworking, where basically the boards bow in a certain way. And it could be caused by a number of different things. We got to try to figure that out right now. All right, it's better, but it's not where I want it to be. So let me see if I can come up with some other options, and we'll go from there. Oh, by the way, since this kind of showed up here, triathlon training is a lot of fun. Triathlon bikes, they are squirrely little you know, you can probably see other little marks on my face too. So yeah, I'm all right though, nothing serious. Just me being really stupid. All right, let's figure out a better way to solve this problem. Well, it looks like the board did cup a little bit, but fortunately that's not a big issue. We're going to slap some felt feet on the bottom later on and call that part good. But we're at the point now where if this next step, if you screw it up, you've kind of ruined your entire project. We're putting a nice clear resin coat on top of the board, therefore we're going to have a nice clean flat surface for all the buildings and other terrain that is so integral to WarCry. Before the pour though, I've got my level here. I want a nice flat level surface for pouring the resin, and to get this board nice and level, I printed up my 3D printer, some little black hexes here that are 3 millimeters, 2 millimeters, and 1 millimeter thick, and that's going to let me adjust the height of the four corners to get a nice level surface. I don't know how much I need for this process. It's a mix of 1-to-1 ratio kind of a thing, and I'm probably going to end up doing multiple pours anyway. Hopefully that looks halfway as decent. I ran a few tests, and by few I mean one, and it kind of works and looks all right. Here we go. So if you've been around with the show for a while, there's a bit of a reoccurring theme that I can't do simple math. Now I thought I'd figured out exactly how big this board was, how deep it was, and I had a pretty good idea as to how much resin I would need, and I bought 32 ounces. That was nowhere near enough. So I got 4 times more, just to be safe. So while the resin is curing down there in the board, it's time to go back and finally finish painting my corpse rack mausoleum. Yes, corpse rack mausoleum. This terrain set's been released like 3 times by GW, so I have to kind of double check the name of the one I have. But it's the WarCry version of the Gardens of Moor, Sigmar mausoleum or whatever. So if you want to watch this tutorial where I paint these buildings up, which happens to be, I think, my most hated video on my YouTube channel, you can find a link in the show notes. I have a feeling the title may have been a little too clickbaity for people. An unfortunate side effect of doing multiple resin pours is that I got a bit of an uneven surface. Now it doesn't really affect the balance of miniatures or buildings or anything, but it does look a bit odd under bright lights. I'm going to try to clean that up as best I can. I am going to be spending basically forever trying to get all these little imperfections in the resin cleaned out by pouring more resin. I guess the moral of the story is do the entire pour in one giant go and not across a week because you ran out of resin. Okay, let me get the feet on the bottom of this thing to let it sit on a nice stable feet for not marring up table surfaces, get some terrain on this guy, and call it done. I am so glad to be done with this project. It took way too long. In case you're wondering how long it took, well, I don't think I cut my hair at all during the course of the filming. Yeah, so it's been a while. Plus, you'll also see some, I guess, behind the scenes of how I film these videos by washing my hair, so just kind of keep that in mind as you watch this thing now. Here we are at the very end. If you want more Age of Sigmar videos, I've got some of those. You can see how I painted the Corpse Rack Mausoleum buildings, links in the description, and also links to my tutorials for painting up my Sigmarines right here. And with that, once again, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. Thank you guys all for watching, and have a good night, or whenever you happen to be watching this, because it just happens to be, I guess it's night now. Friggin' winter.